The tension in the conference room was suffocating, the kind that pressed against your throat and made every breath feel like defiance. It was day 2 of the International Sovereignty and Resource Security Summit in Brussels, and already the event had become a theater of cold stares and barely concealed hostility. But nothing had prepared the room for what was about to unfold. At one end of the long oak table sat Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. He had arrived without ceremony, no entourage, no media trail, just a leather folder, a calm presence, and a gaze that had rattled more than a few delegates. His silence was deliberate, his stillness unnerving. At the opposite end sat J.D. Vance, junior U.S. Senator from Ohio and a rising star in American foreign policy. He had come with a purpose: protect American interests, push back against what Washington increasingly viewed as ungrateful nationalism, especially the kind embodied by Traoré. The room was filled with dignitaries, diplomats, economists, defense analysts. Flags flanked the walls. Translation headsets buzzed quietly. Discreet cameras streamed the session live to millions. The panel's official theme was Natural Resource Sovereignty in the Global South. The real discussion was about control. Then Vance spoke. "I think," he began with a measured glance toward Traoré, "I think we need to be honest about who belongs at tables like this." His voice was steady, too steady, the kind of tone meant to trigger applause in Western lecture halls. Some of us represent institutions, stability, order. Others bring noise, theatrics dressed up as revolution. He didn't name Traoré. He didn't have to. The insult floated in the room like smoke. A few delegates chuckled uneasily. The French representative stared into his glass. A Canadian diplomat fidgeted with their tablet. Even Troy's interpreter hesitated whether to translate Vance's jab verbatim. Traoré didn't blink. Vance leaned in now, bolder. "Let me be blunt," he said, turning toward him. "Some of us earned our place here through democratic systems, through legitimacy. And some took power by force and now pretend that makes them equals. But sitting in this room doesn't mean you belong here." The air cracked with silence. Cameras zoomed in. #TOR trending in real time. What followed wasn't diplomatic pause. It was something more surgical. The world seemed to hold its breath. Traoré calmly opened his folder, took out a single sheet, and laid it on the table. "Are you finished?" he asked, barely above a whisper. But his voice, it was flint striking steel. Still no one moved, not a shuffle, not a breath. In front of the world, a young African president had just been told he didn't belong. And yet, no rage, no outburst, just, "Are you finished?" Vance smirked, but it was the brittle kind, the kind that hides uncertainty. Then Traoré stood. No cough, no mic squeal, no theatrics. Just the quiet tension of a man who knew his words would outlast headlines. "Senator Vance, you speak of systems, merit, institutions. So let me ask you this. What institution gave your country the right to invade others for oil? What system decided that Africa's minerals should end up in European contracts? What merit placed your companies in control of our gold, our cobalt, our children's futures?" A ripple went through the room. Some looked away, others watched as if history itself was being revised in real time. "You say I seized power, as if leadership in Africa is handed out like medals. My country was being bled dry. My people were dying. And the world sent consultants, not compassion. I didn't seize power. I stepped into the space left by abandonment." He moved a step closer. You say I don't belong here, but I am still standing. After colonization, after exploitation, after coups sponsored by foreign hands, after aid that came with chains disguised as charity, I am still standing." He scanned the room. "Some of you came here wrapped in armored cars and security details. I came here with scars. My nation is poor in dollars, yes, but we are rich in memory. And memory, Senator, is more powerful than money." A reverent silence followed. Then gently, Troy tapped the paper before him. "This is the mineral rights contract your administration pressured us to sign 2 months ago." He looked Vance in the eye. "We declined, and now I understand why that upset you." Vance opened his mouth, but the moderator lifted a hand. "Let the president finish." Troy wasn't done. His fingers remained on the contract, his voice steady, his words precise detonations. "You speak of institutions, Senator Vance, of systems, but whose systems are they?" Traoré's voice was measured, but the question cut deep. Who built them? And more importantly, who were they built to serve? His eyes swept the room. European ministers, American strategists, African presidents who suddenly looked smaller in their seats. These systems weren't global. They were never neutral. They were crafted in places like Washington and Paris, not to uplift, but to silence, to decide who gets to speak and who must sit quietly, grateful to be invited. A quiet stir began. Diplomats murmured, journalists typed furiously. A German translator stopped mid-sentence just to make sure she'd heard him correctly. "You ask what qualifies me to sit at this table?" Traoré continued. "Then allow me to ask you, what qualified your nations to draw African borders with rulers, as if we were puzzles to be played with in smoke-filled rooms?" He didn't wait for an answer. "What gave foreign companies the right to drill into our land, extract our wealth, and sell it to the world without ever once asking permission from the people who live above that soil?" He paused, not out of hesitation, but to let the weight of his words settle like dust in the silence. "I'm not a perfect man," he said, "but I wasn't chosen in boardrooms. I wasn't backed by lobbyists. I was chosen by people in the streets, people who bury their children after terror attacks. I answer to them, not to shareholders." Now the room wasn't just listening, it was leaning in. "You're right, Senator. I didn't come through your institutions because they were never designed to let someone like me in. They were designed to train African leaders to mimic Europeans, to sound American, to kneel like beggars." He turned directly to Vance. "But I do not beg. Not for contracts, not for recognition, and certainly not for respect. Respect is earned, and if surviving centuries of theft, betrayal, and violence, and still walking into this room with dignity doesn't earn it, then your respect is too cheap to matter." Silence. Then a single clap from the South African delegate, then Mali, then Brazil, and suddenly the chamber erupted. Applause, unplanned, unscripted, and very, very real. But Traoré wasn't done. This summit was meant to be about the future of global cooperation, but all we've discussed is who deserves a seat, who gets to speak. That's not a conversation about the future, that's theater for the past. The words landed with slow, surgical precision. "The real question isn't whether I belong in this room," he said, eyes narrowing. "It's whether this room is ready for the future." A hush returned, the kind that comes when truths are no longer hypothetical. Because the future is not a round table where power decides who gets scraps. It is not the IMF deciding how many teachers we can afford. It is not foreign troops guarding our gold mines. A delegate from Ghana gave the faintest nod. A camera zoomed in. The future, Traoré said, his hand now resting firmly on the table, is communities growing their own food, nations refining their own minerals, young Africans who don't have to risk their lives crossing seas to find dignity. He paused, then turned once more to Vance. And hear me clearly, the future does not ask for permission. Vance said nothing. His confidence had evaporated into something quieter, not fear, but recognition. You said I don't belong in this room, Senator, but this room belongs to those who are willing to face uncomfortable truths. It belongs to leaders who understand that strength isn't GDP or missiles. It's how many children sleep in peace at night. It's how much of their dignity your policies leave intact. And something shifted, not just in the room, but in the rhythm, the tone, the weight of it all. Traoré reached into his folder once more and held up a photograph, a barefoot boy standing in a rice field in northern Burkina Faso. This, he said, is the reason I govern, not for legacy, not for applause, not for a seat at summits, for him, for every child like him. He is why I wake up each day to fight corruption, to resist domination, to challenge systems designed to keep us in place. The photo said more than words ever could. It wasn't politics. It was purpose. You asked what qualifies me, Traoré said finally, lowering the photo. I didn't come here to be part of your game. I came here to change the rules. And in that moment, the room that once questioned his legitimacy began to ask something far more profound. Was he the only one here truly qualified to lead it? The tension that once gripped the summit had dissolved into revelation. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He used silence like punctuation, truth like a blade. And across the table, J.D. Vance sat back, arms crossed, expression tight, a man suddenly unsure of the game he thought he was winning. For too long, the United States had set the rhythm, but now, Traoré had shifted the beat, and everyone else was catching up. You speak of power, Senator, Traoré said, his voice calm, almost gentle now. But power is changing. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. The stillness in the room did the work for him. Once, it came from armies, then corporations, then media. Today, power comes from clarity, from knowing exactly who you are, what you stand for, and who you're willing to lose if it means keeping your soul. He scanned the room slowly, not seeking approval, but accountability. For decades, Africa has been invited into rooms like this only to be scolded, labeled corrupt, warned about China, lectured on debt ceilings and democracy as if we were misbehaving students. Then he paused and let his next words slice the air. But tell me this. Who lectures the World Bank when its projects fail? Who scolds NATO when bombs go astray? Who warns the United States when it props up dictators in the name of stability? These weren't new questions, but this time they weren't written on a protest banner outside. They were being spoken from the center of the room. Traoré's tone sharpened. Let me be direct. You don't get to call it global cooperation if you're the only one writing the rules. And you certainly don't get to define legitimacy when your history is a record of colonialism, resource theft, and calculated silence. At the back of the room, aides exchanged looks. Someone typed furiously into their phone. One translator stopped, not because she didn't understand, but because the truth didn't require translation. "I don't need to belong in your room," Traoré said, his voice steady. "Because the world we're building doesn't need your room at all. It needs new rooms, with glass walls, not gated doors, with open microphones, not closed briefings." He turned to Vance again, locked eyes. "And maybe, Senator, the real question isn't whether I belong here," a pause. "Maybe it's whether you do." The words landed like the final bell of a heavyweight match. No one sipped water, no one shuffled papers, no cameras looked away, because the man they tried to box in had just redrawn the lines and the battlefield. The echo of his final question, "Maybe it's whether you do," hung heavier than any statement made that day. It wasn't posturing, it was power, the quiet kind, the kind that rearranges how people think. J.D. Vance shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The man who opened the session with smug confidence now looked adrift, like a senator caught off script, out of place, and painfully aware of it. His lips parted as if to respond, but nothing came. This wasn't cable news. This wasn't the Senate floor. This was history correcting itself in real time. Traoré remained standing, letting the silence stretch just long enough, not awkwardly, deliberately, like a general surveying a high ground newly claimed. "I didn't come here to impress you," he said, turning his gaze across the table, "and I certainly didn't come to be approved by you. I came because my people are watching." His voice softened, but the steel never left it. Boys in Wahigua who plant rice with their bare hands, women in Boyle Lasso walking miles for clean water, children in refugee camps who still find ways to laugh. He looked around the room, letting each face sit with what he'd just said. They don't care about summit badges. They don't care who shakes whose hand. They care about whether they'll eat tomorrow, whether they'll live to adulthood, whether their leaders will defend them or sell them for another IMF loan. A subtle murmur of agreement moved through the African delegates. This wasn't sentiment. This was testimony. Then Vance, struggling to reclaim ground, finally spoke. "Mr. President, I don't question your passion, but if you believe that turning away from international institutions is the answer, you may be sentencing your country to even greater hardship." Traoré turned toward him, slowly, not with aggression, but with precision. "And if you think dependence is development, Senator," he said coolly, "then the hardship isn't mine, it's your definition of progress." He let the silence settle again. "For 60 years, we've been told to reform, to modernize, to comply. And where has it led us? Mountains of interest payments, empty mines, broken health systems, and somehow we get blamed for the poverty your systems engineered." He reached down and slowly closed the folder he had opened when the confrontation began. "We are not asking for charity. We are demanding fairness. We are not walking away from the world. We are walking toward it, but on our terms." Now it wasn't just a rebuke, it was a manifesto. A clear line had been drawn, and Traoré was standing on the side of history where old powers no longer got to set the rules unchallenged. Senator Vance looked around, searching for validation, a nod, a smile, some diplomatic gesture. But the usual choreography had evaporated. The room didn't orbit him anymore. It had shifted toward the man they tried to belittle, toward the voice that had just pierced through years of scripted diplomacy and rewritten the narrative. Traoré stepped forward, his voice even clearer now. "I know why leaders like me make men like you uncomfortable. It's because we refuse to play by the old rules. We don't wait politely for our turn. We don't smile while being robbed." A long breath. "And we don't forget." He didn't yell. He didn't pound the table. He didn't have to. Because Traoré hadn't just responded. He had reset the conversation, and in the process shown everyone in that room and watching around the world that the future wouldn't be negotiated in backrooms or dictated from podiums. It would be spoken into existence, one unshakable truth at a time. "You called me emotional," Traoré said, turning again to face Vance. "But tell me, what's more emotional than invading countries for oil, than toppling governments for contracts, than punishing entire nations because they chose a path outside your playbook?" A cough echoed from the back, awkward, out of place, like someone had just remembered where they were. "You say I don't belong in this room," Traoré continued, "but let me tell you what this room has become. A place where power is mistaken for wisdom, where age substitutes for virtue, where influence is allowed to replace integrity." He lifted his chin, voice steady. "And if that makes me a threat to this room, then so be it." This wasn't just defiance. It was reclamation. "You call the system that rewards silence, Senator. A system that keeps Africa kneeling, one hand out for grants, the other handing over its resources. But I didn't come here to beg," he said, his tone cutting through the murmurs now rising. "I came to warn." Now he turned to the full assembly. "Africa is awakening. And when a continent awakes, it doesn't ask permission to rise. It simply rises." That was when the moderator, who had barely spoken throughout the confrontation, leaned forward and spoke quietly into the mic. "President Traoré, the floor is still yours if you wish to continue." Traoré looked across the room, at the panel, at the blinking red cameras, and beyond them, at the world. "I will continue," he said, "but not for this room." His voice rose, not in volume, but in purpose. "I continue for the rooms that never had microphones, for the fields where summits are never held, for the mothers who buried children because of decisions made in places like this." Now he wasn't addressing Vance. He wasn't even speaking to the summit anymore. He was speaking through it. "I didn't come here to be tolerated," Traoré said. "I came because the world needs to understand. Africa is not your project. It is not your experiment. And it is not your warning label for failed development." He began pacing gently behind his chair, no longer driven by anger, but by clarity. "You ask us to follow trade rules we didn't write, to pay debts we didn't create, to play fair in a game that was rigged before we were even born, and then you blame us for not winning." Not a word from the other leaders, not even from those who disagreed, because what he was offering wasn't rhetoric, it was a mirror, and they didn't like the reflection. Traoré turned and gestured to the summit's official logo hanging high on the wall. "Cooperation for a new century." You write words like cooperation on banners, but we know what that's meant for us. Extraction, interference, interrogation. We don't want another seat at your table. He paused. We want the table rebuilt. The phrase struck like thunder. In an instant, it was clipped, posted, translated and trending. Hashtag rebuild the table spread from African Twitter to European media feeds and beyond. I will not allow my people to be reduced to bullet points in your economic forecasts. We are not forecasts, we are the force. He stopped pacing. He turned once again to the hall, a sea of suits, earpieces, and now silence. I know these words will make some of you uncomfortable, he said, softly. Good. Comfort has protected too many lies. Maybe discomfort can finally make room for truth. Even Vance had stopped shifting in his seat. The fire in him had dulled, not into agreement, but into recognition. Traoré turned to the glass doors at the back of the chamber. Out there are thousands of young Africans watching this summit, not to be entertained, but to see if the world still thinks they're invisible. He leaned forward, voice firm. Let me make it clear. They are not. He let the silence stretch. And neither am I. The moderator didn't speak. He didn't need to. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the man they tried to minimize, and who had just turned a speech into a seismic shift. Traoré returned to his seat, but he hadn't sat down. He had landed. The kind of landing that comes after turbulence, after headwinds, after a storm that doesn't just clear the sky, it changes the climate. The room remained still. Nearly a full minute passed in total silence. No one moved. The German chancellor looked at his prepared notes and quietly closed the folder. The French foreign minister whispered to his aide, and the aide shook her head. Even the IMF director, known for his long-winded intros, leaned back wordlessly. And J.D. Vance. He stared at the nameplate in front of him, the one that once felt like a title. Now it looked more like a label on a door that had just closed behind him. The moderator finally cleared his throat, not to speak, but to signal that everything had changed. And nothing could go back to what it was before. Thank you, President Traoré, the moderator said, voice cautious but sincere. Your words will undoubtedly shape the rest of this dialogue. But everyone in the room knew the truth. Traoré hadn't just shaped the dialogue, he had redefined the terms. In the back row, reporters scrambled to update headlines in real time. Burkina Faso president electrifies Brussels summit. Young leader silences critics in global standoff. Traoré's calm fire leaves Vance speechless. And while cameras zoomed in, hoping for some sign of triumph, Traoré didn't gloat, he didn't smirk. He simply leaned back and took a sip of water from the same glass he'd quietly lifted earlier before being told he didn't belong. Now, no one dared suggest otherwise. The Brazilian delegate was the first to raise a hand. If I may, he said, I'd like to echo the president of Burkina Faso's points. Before we proceed with policy, perhaps we need to examine this room itself and who it was built to serve. That opened the floodgates. South Africa backed him, then Indonesia, then Chile, then Kenya, then Serbia. Within 10 minutes, the summit had shifted course entirely. No longer were they discussing aid formulas or budget models. Now the conversation was about agency, about who gets to speak, who gets heard, and who gets to decide when the microphone is passed. Eventually, J.D. Vance spoke again, but his voice no longer carried the sharpness it once did. I still believe in structure, he said, but perhaps that structure must evolve. It was the closest thing a man like him could offer. That evening, as the summit ended its final session, Ibrahim Traoré walked the marble hallway outside the chamber. Cameras followed, delegates reached out, young journalists rushed forward, not with scripted questions, but with something more rare: hope. One asked, "Mr. President, how does it feel to change the conversation?" Traoré paused mid-stride. His answer was quiet, almost tender. "It's not about changing the conversation. It's about reminding the world we've always had something worth saying. They just weren't listening." And then he walked on, not as a guest in someone else's house, but as the architect of a new one. By morning, the headlines weren't about resolutions. They were about a tone, a moment, a name: Ibrahim Traoré. It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a flashpoint. Political scientists called it the Brussels reversal. Activists in Nairobi called it the room reclaimed. Even Western commentators grudgingly admitted the youngest man in the room had delivered the oldest truth. Vance returned to Washington under a cloud. Fox News tried to spin the story, "America confronts rising African radicalism," but the clip told another story: the silence after his insult, the answer that followed, the way the room turned, not toward him, but away from it. It was unspinnable. In Africa, the impact was seismic. Students at the University of Ghana held spontaneous debates titled "Who Belongs in the Room?" Nigerian comedians turned Vance's speech into viral skits. And in Ouagadougou, billboards went up with a photo of Ibrahim Traoré at the summit, standing tall beneath 5 simple words: "We never needed permission." At dawn, inside the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré met quietly with his advisors. The air was cool. His tone was grounded. "This was never about me. It still isn't. It's about what happens when we stop asking to be heard and start speaking like we already matter." Maurice Sankara, now his national security chief, nodded. "They'll come harder next time. New weapons, economic, digital, psychological." "I know," Traoré replied. "But now we've seen what happens when we don't flinch." Later that week, a letter arrived at the palace. No official seal, no embassy stamp. Just a folded piece of paper, handwritten by African diaspora students studying in Boston. "Thank you, Mr. President, for not whispering, for not waiting, for proving that dignity doesn't need translation." Traoré folded it neatly and tucked it into his jacket. He kept it there for days. Across Africa, something began to shift. Not a revolution, not yet, but something deeper, a remembering of who they were before borders were drawn in foreign capitals, before loans replaced land, before power was measured by proximity to Paris or Washington. And at the center of that remembering stood a man who was told he didn't belong, a man who walked into their room, turned it upside down, and walked out without raising his voice, because sometimes the loudest thing a leader can do is refuse to be small. They told him he didn't belong, that his age, his accent, his country were reasons to sit down, not stand up. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't come to be included. He came to be undeniable. In a room built to silence him, he didn't shout, he didn't plead. He simply told the truth, quietly, relentlessly, and without apology. And it shook the marble walls. It cracked open decades of diplomatic performance. Vance came to make an example of him. He did. Just not the example he expected. because what happened in Brussels was not just a moment. It was a message. Africa does not need permission. It needs the mic. And now that it has it, the world better be ready to listen. This wasn't diplomacy. This was dignity. And dignity, once awakened, does not go back to sleep.